Before coming to Santa Barbara 2.5 years ago, the church I had been serving for 7 years was the most politically divided evenly that I'd served throughout my ministry career. Even so, in our first 5 years together, the church grew to become the 5th largest Methodist church in our region. We'd have over 300 people regularly in worship. And on Easter Sundays, we'd have 700 or 800 folks for Easter. And members from both sides of the political spectrum would tell me that they appreciated my ministry, that they appreciated my preaching, and the way that I led the church. But as we entered into 2020, issues about LGBTQIA plus inclusion were roiling at the Methodist denomination, our denomination. And then on March 11th, 2020, the COVID pandemic was declared, and with it, all the acrimony surrounding social distancing and masking and eventually vaccinations fueled discontent. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd's life was snuffed out by police officers on the streets of Minneapolis, and Black Lives Matter protests erupted nationwide. On November 3rd, 2020, the sitting president was defeated at the ballot box. But for the first time in our nation's history, our country did not experience a peaceful transition of executive power. And then violence rocked our capital on January 6th, 2021. In a sermon on the next Sunday, I shared how the events of January 6th had left me feeling bereft as I had felt on another day in our national history, 9/11. 3 Sundays after that, our associate pastor preached, sharing how it felt for her to witness the first woman being sworn in as vice president. And she said this: "As I watched, I was moved to tears a few times by the historic firsts. My own experience as a girl, last born in a family with 3 older brothers, the first in my family on both sides to obtain a postgraduate degree, and the first female pastor appointed to St. Paul's United Methodist Church in Coronado in its 135-year history, overfilled my heart as Kamala Harris laid her hand on the Bible to be sworn in as the first female biracial vice president." Well, in early February, I learned that more than a handful of key members were upset with me, so I went to call on these folks. I was warmly greeted by one couple, and then I said, "Well, I'm here because I heard that there's something upsetting you." The husband, a retired Navy captain, told me that I should have never said that January 6th was the same as 9/11. And he was also upset that our associate pastor had anything positive to say in reference to Kamala Harris, who he referred to as that evil woman. Well, I told him that I had never actually said that the 2 events I was referring to in my sermon were the same. That what I'd said was, I felt the same level of anguish over the two events. And then I said I understood why our associate pastor, a female, would be so moved by the swearing in of the first female vice president. And then I added, and truthfully, in some ways, January 6th seems worse than 9/11, as the violence was perpetrated by citizens of our own country. Now, to that point, we were having an honest exchange. The conversation had all the elements needed for the currency of truth to flow: authenticity, integrity, speaking honestly about what was real and true for both of us, even though we disagreed and even though it was uncomfortable. And then he said, well, no one got hurt on January 6th. I felt my mouth and my face go slack. I had esteemed this man as having great integrity, but his version of reality was untrue. You know, by February, by the time I visited, 4 or 5 people had died, and 140 police officers had been injured. And I was taken aback that he was choosing a provably dishonest narrative when the truth was so knowable. And I sat there thinking, how can I in good faith urge this couple to remain in the church? And so I said nothing. As one seminary professor had said during my studies, as ministers, we're in a vocation that must tell the truth. But I think that seeking to discern the truth and to tell the truth is a basic spiritual standard for all people of faith. When the psalmist asks, "O Lord, who may abide with you and dwell with where your holiness resides?" The answer comes: those who walk blamelessly, do what is right, and speak truth from their heart. It seems to me that being a person of faith is being a person who seeks truth and speaks truth. That they go hand in hand. Now, having just alluded to the currency of truth, I want to locate us where we are in our next church sermon series. We're exploring 6 holy currencies that are articulated by Eric Law. And Law asserts these 6 currencies are needed to flow in order to ensure that a church's ministry is sustainable and missional. Last week, we explored the currency of relationships. This week, we're exploring the currency of truth. And so this model invites us, and I like this about this model, and it invites us not to just see our stewardship in terms of financial giving. It invites us to consider many resources that we have, time and truth and wellness, that we can contribute to the well-being of our church and our community. But it's ironic, I spend a lot of time, I plan way ahead my preaching schedule, and I did not realize until this week that I'd chosen the currency of truth to preach on this Sunday. I didn't realize that it would coincide with January 6th. But since it does, I'd want to share what Don Hodges, a Washington, D.C. police officer injured in the attack, said this week, reflecting on those events. He said, 5 years ago, I thought, this has to be the most videotaped crime in American history. It's just so much evidence. There's no way anyone can possibly deny what occurred. But that's exactly what's happening. History is being rewritten. The attack, said Hodges, was everything it appeared to be on television. Early on in my ministry, I read a very powerful book written by the psychologist Scott Peck, People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing from Human Evil. The book explores the psychology of human evil, and in one footnote, Peck writes this: since the primary motive of evil is disguise, one of the places evil people are likely to be found is within a church. What better way to conceal one's evil from oneself, as well as from others, than to be a highly visible Christian? And note, he talks about how people who are concealing their evil are often hiding it from themselves too, not asking self-assessment questions. But then he adds this: I do not mean that the evil are anything other than a small minority among the religious, only that evil people tend to gravitate towards piety for the disguise and concealment that it can offer. It's an interesting book to read as a minister. But in contrast, and in addition to what I've said so far, I want to point out a couple things that Eric Law says about truth as a holy currency. And first, he points out that the Hebrew word for truth, emet, is composed of the first, middle, and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And he suggests that this signifies that in order to know the truth, we need to know the beginning and the middle and the end. And that we can never take one moment or one feeling or one perspective or one verse and call it the truth. Second, the Chinese symbol for truth is printed on the cover of your bulletin. I want to invite you to look at it. It's one of the words for truthful or genuine. And the top part, which looks like a cross, represents the number 10. The middle part, that's kind of a box or square with grid lines, represents I, the I. And the bottom part is pretty clearly the symbol for table. And Law suggests that discerning truth requires we look at an issue or an event in a holistic way with 10 different eyes, 10 perspectives at the table. And that this will allow us to move beyond the kind of black and white thinking or unquestioning certainty or the ideological rigidity that so often is used to hide evil, inviting us instead to seek and speak the truth in love, as Ephesians 4:15 counsels us to do. So as we consider our 2006 gifting plan for the currency of truth, I want to mention these cards are available at the back table. And if you didn't get the mailing that we sent out, there's a letter with all 6 cards for each 6 weeks, so you can use them. But I wanted to say that because misinformation and propaganda is so rampant, I wanted to share that some high schools and college campuses are implementing a civic online reasoning curriculum. Boy, do we need it. And it teaches a skill that we could all benefit from called lateral reading. And basically, the students learn how to fact-check claims by first looking at the original source, not just the item, but the source behind it. And then looking at secondary sources, what secondary sources say about the same topic, and then making a judgment by synthesizing what they have explored. And in one experiment, in just 6 hours, 12th graders nearly doubled their ability to locate quality information as compared to a control group. So that's pretty hopeful, but I understand too that the challenge for us is how do we have all this time to do all that fact checking? But I share this because the currency of truth giving cards we have includes suggestions that there may be things about your family, your own history, or your church, or your town, or your country that you might decide you want to research to better know the truth. As an example, our neighborhood, the San Roque neighborhood, that is where we live. It's the church-owned house. And we have heard that it was the last area, San Roque was the last area neighborhood in Santa Barbara to not have restrictions on who could own property there based on their race. Now, somebody here may be able to tell me, but I didn't research it this week because I wanted to put it down on my currency of truth card, so I can do the research. But the fact of the matter is I've repeated that a couple times without having checked the veracity of that. So that would be a good idea for me. So just as last week, when you look at the cards, remember that the suggestions are just that. They're suggestions. However, God is calling you to live into deeper truth this year, write that down on your card. Make that commitment to do that. And then recalling what we talked about last week, the 3 degrees of influence. Don't do more than 1 or 2 items on the card. Knowing that, or what God is calling you to do, knowing that what we do will influence our friends' friends, and our friends' friends. That's 3 degrees of influence. So, if there's about 120 people here today and 70 online, the currency of truth could flow over more than 1,000 people. And as we can see from the recent events in our world and in our nation, we need to help the currency of truth flow in our country and throughout our culture. Amen.